an honor for me to be here with you to share what I'm passionate about, which is the continent. I spent the past 25 years doing work on the continent, academically as well as an entrepreneur, and also working very closely with the corporate sector as well as development finance institutions. So for me today is a great day. I'm quite excited and I really can't wait to get started. So the topic today is really about Africa, your partners towards a sustainable future. And I'm going to be taking a private sector lens as I engage with you this afternoon. My views are my views. They're not representing the views of any organization or institution I've consulted to or I'm currently affiliated with. So I'm speaking here today in my personal capacity. When we talk about Africa, the one question I always like to ask people around me, leaders, decision maker, entrepreneur, is it a glass half full or half empty? You don't have to answer me now, but I really hope that as I provide more insights based on my knowledge of the continent, my experience, you will be able to determine for yourself if Africa is actually a glass that is half full or half empty. Your perspective on that will also be quite interesting. Thank you. Next slide. With regard to today, I thought it would be quite important to talk about the context in which we are currently operating, we are currently working, we are currently doing business from a global as well as an Africa perspective. We cannot talk about private sector development today on the continent without mentioning the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is very, very important for the development of the continent. And I also thought it would be quite good to delve further into private sector development and more importantly, to look at the existing opportunities that are there for you as potential investors or even for those who are already investing on the continent. I have a case study. The case study was actually chosen quite purposefully. One looks at a mega project, another one looks at a smaller initiative, just to say that the possibilities are there within the continent, whether you are a large organization or an entrepreneur running your first venture or running a small to medium-sized enterprise. So I'll be focusing on those four main agenda items, starting off with the context. When we think of today as either business owners or corporates, we are faced with the global health crisis, which started off in 2019, in December 2019, in Wuhan, in China. It didn't just end there, it became a pandemic. And today, the whole world has been affected and is still attempting to recover. Interestingly, economists are saying that it's no longer a health crisis, it's an economic crisis. Why is it an economic crisis? Because it's impacting on the livelihood and lives of people. People can't go to work, people can't consume product and services. Economies actually have been, to a greater extent, negatively impacted by the corona virus pandemic. So this is a reality. This is what we are facing, not just Africa as a continent, but globally. But yet we know that there are multinationals that have a strategy in place and some of them are looking at growing into other markets, not necessarily Africa, but to grow outside of the existing, it could be existing market within Europe, and to look for opportunities maybe in other emerging markets like India as an example. But what's going to be that trigger? There could be many triggers, whether you want to invest in India or let's say in Africa. But for any investor today, it's really about looking for ways to de-risk your investment, because organizations are accountable to the shareholder. You need to be able to show and to create shareholder values. Bearing in mind that the world has become much more riskier, much more complex, and much more challenging. So how do we go about de-risking those investments? Like I said earlier on, those corporations are certainly looking at making profit, they are certainly looking at creating shareholder value, but it's no longer just about profit for the sake of profit. It's about the triple bottom line. It's about sustainable intervention, either at home or outside of the border. And we've seen quite extensively this increased focus by multinational as well as domestic businesses to attain the sustainable development goal and to build what we call the Africa we want, which is the Agenda 2063 of the African Union Commission. We believe it's something that is very good. It's something that is quite relevant to the continent. And for any private sector-led organization, we should not lose sight of that. Yes, it's about investment, but it has to be sustainable, bearing in mind the existing context we are operating into. The health crisis is there, and as we are seeing these days, some countries are, because of the vaccine, are in a better shape than where they were a year ago or 6 months ago. But for the continent, I think our biggest challenges are now. There is, if we have to go by what the IMF has predicted, there is a 285 billion US dollar required by African countries between now and the end of 2025 to step up the spending response to the pandemic. The response to the pandemic is not going to be a once-off event. I've seen how countries, especially in Africa, have really, in a way, struggled to meet the existing demand of this pandemic. So the recovery process is really not going to be easy, and it's going to require that organizations look at the spending that countries or government, African government in particular, that are already indebted to many international organizations, relook at how they're going to obviously pay back that money over time. So it's challenging, but also to some extent, it may create opportunities for the private sector to become more active in building and sustaining African economies without losing sight of the fact that they should create shareholder value in a sustainable way. So it's important to understand that, we've seen some construction from the fiscal revenue perspective, just because of the health crisis that African economies or African countries are faced with. African government have to think about the debt sustainability. These are the real issues. And our government are thinking about it every single day. They can't do it alone. Multinational further have also reduced and delayed in some cases, even cancel planned investment on the continent. You can just imagine the effect that this will have had on the economy. I mean, a country like South Africa, where unemployment rate was about 18 months ago at 22%, has shot up to more than 27% within 18 months. This is very, very scary. So the message here is that today's operating context is certainly more complex, much more riskier and challenging than ever before. Therefore, it's very important for the private sector, for any multinational that wants to navigate in this environment, to make sure that they understand the context in which they want to operate so that they can find the right opportunity to tap into. This looks at some of the World Economic Outlook. They're quite fairly recent because they were published in April by the International Monetary Fund. As you will see here, the world economy contracted last year, like minus 3.3. I mean, the pandemic just in a way took us, I would say, even by surprise. So the global economy, though, is projected to grow at 6% in 2021. And I think most of the growth will be seen more towards this last quarter of this year. And again, primarily driven by, obviously, the distribution of the vaccine and also the new reforms that countries and government globally will put in place to create an enabling environment for the private sector to thrive and also for community members to be safe into. Another key point when we look at the slide, we need to look at the emerging market and developing economies as well as sub-Saharan Africa in particular. Last year was not good for sub-Saharan Africa. As I say, our economy also contracted of about 2%, 1.9%, minus 1.9% in 2020. Growth is expected this year, but it's going to be below the world average. And at this moment in time, interestingly, I was watching a program and one of the top economists was saying that although in the early stage, or should I say the upstream stage of this whole COVID-19 pandemic, Africa was not that impacted. Right now, the continent is really the epicenter of all of what is happening around COVID-19. We're talking about, obviously, the tests, we're talking about the lack or limited distribution of vaccine and so forth. You can't open like a newspaper today or read your digital news without something that has been mentioned about that. It is scary because obviously the vaccines are not being distributed as fast as we would have hoped for, but we remain optimistic that the situation will be turned around. We see a positive outlook going forward, but it's not in the double digit. It's still like in the lower single digit, but it's an improvement from 2020. I was looking at the Africa Center for Disease and what they've published. This is quite recent. Interestingly, the Southern Africa region, that is an important region for the continent because it hosts one of the top 2 or largest economy within Africa. It's so badly affected. The region, the number of cases that have been reported there are sitting at 47% within the southern part of Africa, and then followed by northern Africa, countries like Tunisia really being also badly affected. Eastern Africa at 13%, and West Africa as well as Central Africa lagging behind at 8 and 3%. So what is the impact of this on the continent? What's the impact on these figures on Africa, on the economic development of the continent? We are seeing more and more that this is actually deepening inequalities. Already, we have one of the top GNI in the world. South Africa, for instance, when you look at the gaps between the well-off and the poor is very high, followed by Namibia, which is just next door. This is deepening, and it's really scary. So it's important that our effort, and I mean collective effort, not just African government partners, international development finance institutions, regional economic bloc come together to fight this pandemic. Because as they say, the pandemic is not over anywhere until it is over everywhere. And this is the reality. It's just a matter of one country or one continent being badly affected that we know the rest of the world will remain in that situation. So the pandemic is not over anywhere until it is over everywhere. And this really joined the whole principle of what I like about the African Union Commission, talking about not leaving anyone behind. In the development world, this has been broadly embraced. So we need solidarity here because it's about our livelihood, it's about our lives that have been threatened. It's important that we converge, that we forge together to find the right solution to address this health crisis that we are all facing at the moment. You will well know that many sectors have negatively been impacted by this crisis, specifically the air transport industry. I don't know if you've tried to travel like maybe last week internationally. Because of the recovery, the airfares are becoming damn expensive. You will pay as much as, if not 60% or double of what you would have paid, let's say a year ago, for the same destination. So at the end of the day, who pays the price? It's again the consumer, unfortunately. We've also seen, like I said in my earlier slide, that African debt, government debt has skyrocketed. I know up until around 2020, the debt to GDP ratio was around 60%, averaging there. Within the past year, it has ballooned to 66% in sub-Saharan Africa. We have to deal with that. So there is just so much pressure, and we don't want the financing of Agenda 2063 being compromised. And the agenda is really about building the Africa that we want. And the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is one of the key components of that agenda. Thank you. Is there a way to turn this COVID-19 crisis into opportunities? Yes, there may be opportunities. We've seen that some industries have actually done exceptionally well. In the past, we would have had to gather maybe at an AIMS international office to have this workshop. But nowadays, we leverage technology to engage with everyone. So technology has been harnessed better. We can improve domestic resource mobilization, which has not really been a main focus for African government. And more importantly, the need for bold and transformative governance reform, it is critical if we are to take the continent to the next level. Our healthcare and social protection system will also need to be revisited. We need to address issues of climate change. It's not just European issue, American. These are real issues impacting the continent. So we're talking about climate change and green growth. But again, the role of the private sector is so important. There have been times where I sat in big fora and I looked left, right, center and asked myself, we're making big decisions here on infrastructure. Where is the private sector? They should be at the seat. They should be invited. So there's a need to do that more. And I'm sure one of the questions that you will ask perhaps later is, but how do we do that? Because we're not always aware of what's cooking in the kitchen. We can unpack that a little bit later. But I really believe that a multinational, a small, medium-sized enterprises, large companies, and specifically women-owned firms should demand the right to engage and to be part of large projects that have been executed on the continent. And we will need to leverage the African Continental Free Trade area, which actually went officially live just in the beginning of this year on the 1st of January. And already 4 countries have ratified it. So although it is recognized that strong reforms driven by African government are much needed to put the continent on the right path to economic recovery, the private sector has to be part of solution to help and enable the creation of sustainable African economies. I've been talking about this African Continental Free Trade Agreement. What is it all about? Interestingly, the conversation and the negotiation about that started off in 2005. In 2020, the World Bank stated that as the global economy is in turmoil due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the creation of the vast AfCFTA regional market is a major opportunity to help African countries diversify their export, accelerate growth, and attract foreign direct investment. So as you can see, as much as we've been pumping intra-Africa trade, which is so necessary within the continent, it goes beyond that. It is really about the creation of those global value chain and to also enable the continent to engage with the counterpart outside of Africa, and thereby hopefully attracting more FDI, foreign direct investment in Africa. The agreement was signed at the 10th extraordinary meeting that was in Kigali in 2018, but the negotiation had started 3 years earlier. It has been positioned as the world's largest single market because of the number of countries that are participating in that, which 54 countries accounting for over $4 trillion in spending. And what's the rationale behind that? Importantly, it's really about reducing all trade costs. If we have to trade amongst ourselves, we need to reduce those trade costs. I mean, a simple flight from just Abidjan at this moment to Johannesburg will cost you the equivalent of 21,500 rand. We are on the continent. It's a lot of money. Or another flight from here to Cameroon will cost you 400,000 equivalent, which is about 800 to 850 US dollar. That's a lot of money. So we hope that through this agreement, more countries, especially in Africa, will be able to trade amongst themselves, but more importantly, also identify the comparative advantage so that they can better service not just the African market, but also the rest of the world. What we've seen, though, amongst the 5 regional economic blocs that we have in Africa, the East African community has been very active in promoting the ratification. You will see that most of the countries that have ratified are from East Africa. The only outstanding country I understand is Tanzania, which has already indicated that by the end of September, they will ratify. And it will make that economic bloc, the EAC, fully part, of this African continental free trade area. And I think this is fantastic. We need to encourage the same for other regional economic blocs in the Maghreb region, in West Africa, as well as Southern and Central Africa. But for this continental free trade to work for the continent, and again, the private sector has to get involved. It cannot just be about government talking to government. It will never happen, or the intended objective will never get materialized. We need the private sector to be bolder. We need SMEs to be involved in the value chain of large projects that would be obviously be part of this continental free trade area. And I know it's still early stage because some of the trade data that we've been actually asking for since like between January 2021 and now are not forthcoming. But I believe that within the next 6 months or so, we should be able to see exactly what this free trade agreement is actually meaning in concrete terms for the people of Africa. And it's important, the reporting is crucial. Without the reporting, countries will not feel motivated to be part of it. They may have ratified it, they may have signed all the documents, but we want them to do business. We want that. That's what we want to encourage. Is there any benefit for the private sector? Obviously, for anyone involved in promoting services or tangible goods, the one key thing that matters is market. You want to understand if there is a potential market for your product or for your service. And through that, after, you have a market of 1.4 billion people at your disposal. But more importantly, by eliminating a trade tariff on intra-Africa trade also, which makes it in a way economically difficult for African countries to trade amongst themselves, more private sector-led firms will participate in that. So that's so important. The tariff that we pay, the taxes and so forth, custom and what have you, will obviously come down from what has been communicated. We also believe that it will propel Africa's export whilst encouraging countries to diversify the economy. As you will know, Africa is one of the most endowed, if not the most endowed continent, on the planet. It is all rich, it has minerals, it has so much, but yet the poorest. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, for me, it has never added up. I just can't understand why a continent that has so much to offer has still not managed to lift its people out of extreme poverty. And we're talking of those living with $1 or under a day. The numbers are still too high. So AFTA can also provide an opportunity to SMEs to become second-tier contractor to organization, which is something that most SMEs tend to look out for because they'll say, I cannot compete with the giant or the big brand. I can supply. I can be a second-tier supplier so they can subcontract to me. That's an opportunity for our SMEs. And along the way, those SMEs also acquire skills, and there is knowledge transfer and skills transferred, which makes everyone happy. And the idea here is obviously job creation over time and sustainability for those enterprises that are involved in the value chain. I put an example here looking at the manufacturing of goods, leather for the manufacture of leather chair in the automotive industry. We know, for instance, in Ethiopia, this good leather. We know South Africa has a strong automotive industry. South Africa can get his input from Ethiopia as an example. So by establishing these regional value chains, it makes us stronger, and more importantly, it brings also the prices down. The architecture of AFTA provided for the establishment of an African Business Council, which will also act as a continental platform for articulating the views of the private sector. So as you are part of that trade area, you will also have a platform where you could go and voice your opinion. What's working, what's not working, what potential policy changes you as the private sector can drive. So you don't just have policy being enacted without you having given your input. I think that's so important. We shouldn't take it quite lightly. And the policy that are devised should be attractive also for investors. So these are the potential benefits that we see from the private sector. Looking at private sector in its entirety in Africa, as I said, more than ever before, the private sector has a role to play in the economic recovery of African countries at this crucial time. This slide really gives you an overview of what has been happening within the private sector, and where we see the opportunity. We will know that the infrastructure needs on the continent are huge. Africa has large infrastructure development needs, representing 20% of its GDP in the next decade. This is a lot. And therefore, for us to promote economic recovery, on the one hand, we have this government, some of them that was quite stable, but because of the pandemic, has gone into debt and may not be in a position, obviously, to sustain itself. It has to look at other avenues, for investment. It could come from the private sector. It could come from international organization. All of that is so important, that we work together and that we rally to make sure that not just the continent thrive, but that we create jobs along the way and satisfy our shareholder. And like I said, the source of financing can be either domestic or international. This graph is quite an interesting one because it actually shows the median private investment ratio by developing regions. You will see that in sub-Saharan Africa, the last one on my right, SSA, sub-Saharan Africa, private finance has increased in Africa, especially in countries such as Ghana and Ethiopia, but it's still not where it's supposed to be when you look at the infrastructure gap that we have on the continent. Yes, infrastructure is not the only thing that we need to address, but it's one of our biggest challenges at the moment. So it has been demonstrated that the bulk of infrastructure finance is done by the public sector, 95% done by the public sector. Can we change that and bring it to perhaps 75, 25%? What does it require? It's critical that private projects that represent only 5% of total investment infrastructure in the average just change. For me, that number has to change. I do not understand why more privately owned firms are not part of the value chain. They're not involved, they're not given the opportunity to provide services. There are services that can easily be provided by, let's say, a privately owned engineering firm and what have you. It's important that we make it happen. We as leaders of organization will have to be a little bit, I use the word demanding, but I want to say aggressive in what we want to see, not just on the continent, but also for our own corporation, because we have the responsibility, yes, to generate revenue, but also to create a job, to create employment, and what have you. If we do our job well, everyone benefits. I'm looking here at some of the sector for investment consideration. The latest data that was published by the World Bank here dates back to 2017. But I just thought, okay, just to give you an indication, let's look at sub-Saharan Africa. What they call the SDG sector will include education, electricity, health, infrastructure, and water, tend to have high return. That's the reality, because for any investors, you want to see, okay, where do I get my biggest return? You can get into education, electricity, health, infrastructure, and water from what the data shows. And I mean, you have, if we take, for instance, infrastructure, 37 Sub-Saharan Africa as opposed to just 7.5 in Asia and the Pacific. So there could be certainly opportunities there, but we also understand that it's an area that is highly dominated by the public sector. And even the way they structure the financing does not make provision for the private sector to get involved. I think we need to unlock those opportunities. We need to make sure that we, in a way, infiltrate those conversations early enough so that we can also play a role as far as Africa's development is concerned, but more importantly, as part of our own job and role to create value for our shareholder. Thank you. The next slide, please. The next slide just expand on what I said earlier on. Yes, the need for road, electricity, railways, healthcare, more so now than ever before. You will have heard that, I mean, some of the vaccine now will be obviously manufactured inside Africa. I think Senegal is also one of the sites that have been chosen and so forth. But not all countries in Africa have the basic infrastructure. I'm going to look, for instance, at a G5 Sahel country where we see the hidden potential in terms of the mineral, but yet I would say difficult to access by any investor because of the security issue. This is the reality. Any investors want to make sure that if it's not in the short to medium term, but at least in the long term, he's able to recoup his investment. But again, for me, it's a region that should not just be discarded. It has the potential. We're talking about countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, and Chad. These are the countries that make like the G5 Sahel. They are confronted with huge challenges, specifically around the stability of the country. But at the same time, investors who are hungry could go and explore opportunities in other sectors, for instance. But it requires you to be bold, but to be mindful of the fact that there are issues, security issues in particular. Digital financial services really becoming big. What I see happening these days actually is really how organizations, be it the banks or the telecommunication companies, are using it to obviously drive financial inclusion and facilitate the payment of various services. So this can only grow because at the end of the day, because of our challenges around infrastructure, we have communities living in remote areas. Isn't it beautiful to know that you have your grandmother sitting somewhere in Lusikisiki in South Africa, but being able to transact or pay for the electricity and so forth through her mobile? The need for that really, I see, can just go, you know, in leaps and bounds. The manufacturing sector, also an important sector because, yes, it creates jobs, but at the same time, for it to be a true opportunity, you need to identify a country where you do not have energy supply challenges. The energy supply challenges are a reality again, you know, that most African countries are facing. I know some of them are looking at renewable and so forth, but you cannot have a strong manufacturing sector if you do not have a strong energy sector. Bill Gates talks about investing in clean technology that will help the world avoid a climate disaster. And I mean, he's already working with people across the world. And some of those technologies include direct air capture, green hydrogen, long duration energy storage, sustainable aviation fuel. So now we're talking about being innovative. COVID-19 is challenging us to reset ourselves, to be bold, and to think differently. So these are some of the industry and sectors that opportunistic firm or multinational or even small and medium-sized enterprises may want to consider. Great. The last two are case studies, and they were selected on purpose. The Enda brand, I don't know if you're familiar with Enda brand. It's a sustainable running shoes that we have in Kenya, manufactured in Kenya for the local market, the regional market, and as well as the international market. And what is quite good, is nice to see that the company is co-owned by women who will in a way fall also under what we call like the youth. Youth means like anyone aged between 18 and 35. These are initiatives that we want to encourage. And I think that through the after, companies like Enda can really benefit a lot. And we can only encourage that. This is a small venture, quite successful. And this is despite the statistic that we know of 65 to 80% of new businesses disappearing or going out of business within the first 3 years of operation. This organization is still in business, they're employing people, and they're now exporting the product to the United States. And I thought this was quite encouraging. We have, on the other hand, the Tanzania project, the construction of the standard gauge railway project. It's a big project where you had multiple financiers, but the lead one there was the Standard Chartered Bank in Tanzania, which in a way carried in the Export Credit Agency of Denmark and Sweden. Big project. I mean, we're not talking about $500 million. This is a 1.4, almost $5 billion project. But what we look at here is the impact that this project is having also on the community. Are we creating jobs? Are we improving the services costs? What is the main benefit? And this project is delivering on that and much more because through the railway, it will be able to link Tanzania to Burundi to Rwanda and DRC, thereby facilitating intra-regional trade, which is something that obviously after is in a way facilitating and supporting. So projects like this can only be welcome on the continent because we can see that the development outcomes are positive. And they also integrate women in the value chain. So my key message here is that mega to small size projects can thrive on the continent. However, one needs to understand that it takes much more than just having the finance in place for a project to be a success. There is so much that goes behind that. Your understanding of the environment, the leadership team that you have on the ground, how well you engage with your stakeholder, and also resilience. You're not going to leave a country just because you face your first challenge or the second challenge. You know, it should be a commitment. For me, sustainable is not about short term. And one needs to understand that along the way, one will be faced with challenges. The question is, have you prepared your team to face those challenges in those markets? That's extremely important because as you will know, Africa is peculiar. Yes, we are 54 countries, but we are also different. If you've just been to South Africa, you cannot just say South Africa is like Cameroon because they're both in Africa, completely different. My strong message here is, yes, you've got the financing, that's the starting point. But how well have you prepared yourself and your team member to unlock those opportunities for you within your time frame? In closing, what I would like to say here, and I'm drawing down more on my personal experience, again, on the continent, it's really about succeeding on the continent for me has been around three main things. Having that leap of faith, But obviously, that leap of faith, not in a vacuum, but that leap of faith that will have been based on like your understanding of the environment. And at some point, you've got to decide whether you're going or not. It is very important. And you cannot also be in a what I always call analysis paralysis, where you want to see the data, you want to see this, you want to see that. 1 or 2 or 3 trips to the country or to the continent will help you make that decision. I'm not saying ignore the data. The data is important, but you also have that gut that you should at times listen to. So that's number one. Number 2 is really about being well equipped. You need to have a toolbox. Are we moving into Africa because it has become fashionable and everyone is talking about Africa being the investment frontier? Or is it part of your global strategy? And if it's part of your global strategy, what are the steps that you're going to put in place to make sure that you succeed in that market? So being equipped looks at your technical skills, it looks at your knowledge of the market, it looks at the people you want to engage with, it looks also at your competitors. What are they doing in those markets? Are they present? Or are you wanting just to have the first mover advantage, be in the market and not do anything? So you need to think through that. The last part for me has been really about cultivating humility. Your frame of reference, as much as you may be in a developed market, should in a way be discarded. Come here with an open mind and assess the situation as it is. But more importantly, it's about being also respectful of the people you're dealing with. I'm going to actually share a story, and this happened in a very remote part of Cameroon, where you can see people have nothing. They may not even have had the means to put food on the table the day before, but they still have a smile on their face, because for them, what matters is the dignity. So we should never forget that. That is just so important. So by going into other, not just in Africa, but more so within Africa, bear that in mind. Try to be humble. Try to learn. You may have created a product that succeeded in America or in Europe. It doesn't mean that it's going to succeed in Africa. Understand the market, understand the language. There are many cases of products that fell on the continent just because of the fact that the cultural nuances were not taken into account and so forth. So I just thought I should bring that out and really say, take that leap of faith. You feel ready, be well equipped, and cultivate humility. And the last word from me to you is really about be fearless if you want to impact the world. Your world may just be you and your immediate family, it's okay. Or it could be your direct team member, or it could be your entire organization, it could be Africa, it could be the entire world as we understand that. But at times, you need to put that fear aside. And just as Nike would say, do it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Nathalie. That was really an inspiring. It was realistic and inspiring at the same time, which is really superb. We've got a couple of questions that was already sent to us before, so we'll see how far we get in terms of time. The first question that I will pose to you, which was sent in by Arthur, I think, was just in your opinion, what are those first sort of fundamental basic do's and don'ts when a business, that's one of our clients, are considering Africa as their next investment destination? Where do they start? What should they first consider?
I would say it's really first, I've even covered it in the presentation, it's about inside, and inside. That's the do part, It's really about knowing your market. You will need to gather information about the market you want to penetrate for you to be in a position to make an informed decision. And nowadays, information can be collected from the web if they're relevant to you and also not obsolete. Or you could you could commission some research and get a third party to look at a specific market on the continent or a specific product you want to launch, and then learn from there. So it's very important that we take the time, we invest the time to analyze the environment. And the environment is also the internal environment. My question during the presentation was, why are we even considering Africa? Is it because it's fashionable? Is it because we've seen our competitors doing that? Or is it because it is good for our business? It's because our board already is looking into that direction. So you need to ask those questions. And as you ask those questions, take the opportunity to do your own SWOT in terms of you moving into the continent. Do you have the resources? Will your board be able to support you with some kind of seed capital to, I don't know, launch an initiative on the continent? So it all starts off with inside, and inside. Do not, I'm just going to give you one example. It's really not about a copy and paste thing. Don't take your global strategy and paste. Yes, you may be lucky with one or two intervention, but it's not sustainable. There will need to be the need for adaptation, or to, again, go back to item one, which is like insight. What insight do we have about this market? What insight do we have about our service offering? Because at the end of the day, you want to take the edge. You don't want to always be a follower. So it's important that you understand your market. For me, that would be something that I would want to emphasize. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you. Yes, I referred to one of our clients. Actually, I think one of the CEOs could be here today from Kenya. But the chairman, Shai of Clapton, said to us, when they enter an African market, in fact, any market, they do reinsurance in emerging markets. And he said, when we make the decision to enter, we don't leave. It's a long-term decision. So we don't just test and we say, oh, it's not going to be great, let's just move on. It's not what we want. So it's what you were talking about. When you have your first obstacle, don't just run away. You need to have that as part of your long-term business strategy. So great. I love what you're saying. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And of course, there are a lot of people here who can support in getting that insight into some of the markets that our clients might want to go into, including yourself, Nathalie. The second question that we had was actually one of mine, and I'm a strong believer, in helping people to fish instead of handing out a fish. So and this is something that Africa, we have a long history of aid and sort of handouts, etc. And I'm certainly a believer that that's not always the answer. Yes, of course there are some instances where this can be validated, but better put by Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, which is one of our great women, currently the DG of the World Trade Organization. She gave a talk already years ago about trade instead of aid. And as an entrepreneur, I mean, you're an entrepreneur, you're a business enabler, advisor, and then of course you've got great experience with the African Development Bank, etc. What is your opinion on trade versus aid in this African context?
Wow, thank you. That's a very, very good question. In fact, the conversation on trade and aid has been going on for a very, very long time. And you have different school of thought. Some will say we favor trade, others will say we favor aid. For me, it's always about, let's go back to the basic. The basic for me is to understand this market in which we are operating. This is the most endowed continent in the world. We have minerals, we have like oil, gas, we are leading producer of cocoa, yet our people, some of us have never eaten chocolate or seen chocolate. We have that, but why is that the continent has not been able to tap into this wealth these natural resources and turn them into real opportunities that can lead to the socio-economic development of the continent. Why is that? Why hasn't it happened? That's the question I first asked myself. Dambisa Moyo, she's an African female economist, published a book, I think about a decade ago, on debt aid, in which she, in a way, demonstrates why aid is not good for Africa, as it does encourage, I would say, a dependency and some kind of entitlement. And I mean, I do agree with that point of view to some extent. In fact, President Kagame from Rwanda said that there is bad aid and there is good aid. So on the one hand, you have a school of thought that say aid overall is bad. On the other hand, you have a school of thought that say you have bad aid and you have good aid. So what is good aid? The bad aid is what that Visa spoke about, this over-reliance on others to come and resolve our own problem, our own issues, to always give us handout. This obviously needs to stop at some point. I mean, most African countries have become independent since 1960, 60. So for over like 60 years, we have not achieved economic independence. It is worrisome. And bad aid for him is really about what I've just described, that over-reliance on others to do things for us, which even create at some point that sense of entitlement, which is wrong. But President Kagame believes that good aid is that which is targeted to create a capacity in people so that they are able to live on their own activity. So it almost becomes like a catalyst to something bigger and better, so that tomorrow you're not going to obviously asking for that aid because you will have become self-sufficient. But that's not what we've seen all these years with the aid. The aid that we've received has still put us, we're still in the same situation we were before 1960. Honestly, if you want to have my honest opinion, I believe that the debate goes beyond trade or aid. It should be about how Africa best leverage its human capital, its youth, its women, to drive its own growth, its own inclusive growth, its own socio-economic development agenda. That's very important. And how does one enforce the principle of good governance in Africa? I'm talking about transparency here. We get all the aid. Do we get to report back on how the money or the fund that we receive have been spent and the impact that that has had on the intended beneficiary of the aid? Do we get to do that? So accountability, transparency is very important. We need to encourage ethical behavior. So for me, again, it boils down to the leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's great insight. Yeah, it's a pity our French partners can't be here today. I believe they've got a public holiday, but I remember President Macron was in, I think, in Ghana recently, and he said, Africa needs to take its own back. You need to stand up for yourselves and start looking after yourself, which I agree. And that means we need to build the leaders in Africa to be able to do this. It is in our youth. I think the answer is certainly in our people, for sure. We have another question from Theo in Nigeria, who puts a quite a difficult question forward, and he said, we've got two of the biggest economies in sub-Saharan Africa, which are currently in decline, with some political instability, etc. And this is, this is a pattern that seems to be repeating itself in Africa, unfortunately. Could you advise the audience why investors should come to Africa despite this, and not necessarily invest in the more stable economies in the Far East, for example, or in South America then?
Okay. Also, very good question. I mean, the rationale. Yes, I agree with him. Our leading economies have not been doing well, but we also understand the reason behind that. We also want to believe that the right reforms are going to be put in place to turn around the situation. So I don't think that the situation in South Africa or in Nigeria will remain like this for years to come. I spoke about leadership earlier on. We need to obviously do the right thing, but more importantly, we need to create jobs and we need to create an enabling environment for companies to thrive. Up until we have that, it's really going to be difficult. We're going to lose those potential investment to maybe the Far East or South America. But what I also want to say is that the World Bank does this study every year. They call it doing business in the world. They look at various regions. Interestingly, I mean, quite consecutively for the past like a decade, Africa has always been about one of the top, countries or top 10 countries that, uh, I mean, when I say Africa, I mean an African country has always been amongst, the top 10 countries that are implementing reforms. So as much as we may be in a bad situation, the most important thing to look at is what's the leadership that we have? Are we anticipating positive economic reform that will obviously make it easy for everyone to operate in that market? Yes, as a multinational, we have option to invest where we believe we're going to have our highest return faster. But I was very open and direct in my introduction where I said we're talking about sustainable investment. We're not talking about going in now, looking at the situation and removing your money the moment you see things are not quite stable. That's why it's important to build also the local partnership and to work to some extent. I know the private sector in general tend to to stay away from the government. No, we don't want them. But at some point, you have to engage them. Organizations have understood that have created position for like stakeholder engagement or government engagement and so forth. It is important. So I still hope that, with what is happening, not just in South Africa and Nigeria, but with what is happening in other countries like Rwanda, for instance, uh, we will, even Ethiopia, which at some point was growing at double digit, we will continue to attract foreign direct investment on the continent. Thank you.
And adding to that, Nathalie, in your opinion, which are the most promising African countries right now for investment?
Wow. So maybe I may speak more to the region, you see, and you also have to remember that when we talk of investment, the question I want to ask you, what industry are you talking about? That's also is quite important.
Yeah, I think his second question was actually, or this could have been Khalid's question actually, was what are the key segments of opportunity? So maybe we should tie those two together and say, if we take one or two or three of the top segments that you feel there are opportunities, in which regions would those opportunities be?
Okay, for the time being, what I'm going to perhaps, if you allow, leave the conversation at a more generic level because I've really not had the time to have a detailed brief on a specific country, but you will know about the opportunities, for instance, within the Eastern African region. I was talking earlier on about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, with the EAC community being the most organized one. And that's where you'll find countries like, obviously, Rwanda, Tanzania, and so forth, that are part of that specific community. We've seen that. We've also looked at the COVID-19 cases, reported cases. We could also see that that specific region, we're not saying that they're not completely affected. They're not the most affected. They're not even the second most. I think we're sitting at 13% of the total within Africa. So these are specific indicators I can give at this point in time. But the moment you start with like working with specific, now you have to delve it now to the next level and say, who are we talking to here? Are we talking to businesses or are we talking to consumer? Let's look at the size of the consumer in that specific market. Then I could also obviously give more pointers. But what I would want to say is that companies should obviously invest where there is a fair level of stability. I know the world is into chaos at the moment, but you will understand the level of stability I'm talking about. So you need to be on the lookout of that, but you also need to be on the lookout for the size of the market. I mean, we have a young population, and quite a good percent of the population is educated these days. But what is the product that you want to offer to that market? That's also important. So there are other variables that come into play at the moment. The Southern African regions, for instance, has been known, and particularly South Africa, even Namibia, for the fact that they had the right infrastructure, strong legal framework, the banking system, world class, great. Do you want to play in the banking market? Do you want to play in the digital, perhaps financial services market? Perhaps it's a market that you may want to consider. But there are other challenges that will come along the way. So at a high level, I would say, based on the in-depth study that I've done, based on my practical experience, right now, it is difficult. It's just a question of, you know, the COVID cases going rampant into a country. It just impacts even psychologically on how the country is perceived by others.
Absolutely.
So we need to control that.
Thank you. I think the other question you've actually answered already, Khalid's question about the African Continental Free Trade Area. You did talk a little bit about the opportunity for foreign investors in that as well. So of course, there's a primary benefit for African countries, but there is also a benefit actually for international investment through that, which you've covered already. Is there anything that you want to add about that?
Not really at this point. We just have to understand that AFTA is a global game changer. And like I said, I don't want to be repeating myself, but it's definitely going to be the largest global free trade, you know, in the world. And it's important that, you know, the private sector participate. We believe that it's certainly going to also help countries to diversify, Africa to create regional value chain, and even be able to negotiate better with the European and American or Asian counterpart. Yeah.
And there was a follow-on that about, you know, do you see this developing into something similar to the EU, you know, as being one sort of trade unit where a country decides to do business with the EU and therefore gets benefits inside each EU member country? Do you think that this will eventually turn into this a similar opportunity?
I think this AFTA is more similar to the NAFTA, like the North African trade agreement, obviously. But in terms of individual countries negotiating with other groups, I'm not really sure about that. But what we're trying to promote here is Africa becoming one bloc and be able, you know, to negotiate at that level with the rest of the world, and also facilitating intra-Africa trade within the continent. And as part of that, we hope that countries will be able to identify the comparative advantage, so that when we talk of timber, we don't just say, Africa produces a lot of timber, you know where you can get the best timber on the continent. When we speak about leather, you know, top of mind, you know, this country is best at that compared to the other one. When we talk about meat processing, you know, we should be able to get to that stage. And for me, with that also comes the Made in Africa stamp, which is very important. I am yet to see products that have that stamp. It's important that we promote our brand and we also export our brand.
Absolutely, and that we add the value, not just export the
Absolutely.
resources, but that we add value and then export. Yes,
exactly. Yes.
We've got time for one or two more. I think one that Kyriakos actually asked, which I think is a good one. What role does All East and or Dubai play in Africa's economic development?
Wow, that's a very good question. Actually, is the person there? Can I ask the person to elaborate a little bit on that? We know that Dubai is in fact, Paris used to be the shopping capital of the world, but Dubai has obviously taken that big spot. There's certainly a lot, that can happen, but I think I will be quite eager to explore. But in such instances, what we normally do is really like trade exchange, you see, like seeing what one country has to offer versus the continent, and then from there on, find a middle ground. It could be in the services industry. Let's not just focus on manufacturing goods. It could be the quality of service also. Dubai attracts so many people. The tourism sector is so well developed there. So certainly Africa can learn, but what can Africa give, to the Middle East? So we can have those conversations.
Kyriakos is here. I don't know if you want to add something.
Thank you.
Kyriakos.
No, thank you. No, I fully understand that it is a multi-industry and multi-sector opportunity. And that's also the perception we have here in Dubai as well.
Okay.
Excellent. But I do believe that as we build collaboration and relationships, there definitely are opportunities. I'm 100% sure they would be, and they will present themselves as we continue these discussions, for sure. Our last question, Nathalie, that we will have time for, I think. Maybe we can throw in one more after that. But the investors from other parts of the world take very seriously the topic of sustainability and ESG. As you know, this question was from Zainab. In your opinion, how well are African countries doing in presenting themselves on the subject? And what are the predicted changes we will see on this topic, especially from markets and countries which are still only starting to adopt this approach to business?
Okay. Wow, that's a very good question. And I actually have a lot of examples to give when it comes to environmental, social, and governance factors that one needs to consider as we screen or even invest in projects. I think for me, and from what I've seen also, is like the visibility of ESG has heightened quite a lot, especially over the past 3 years in terms of what I've seen. I've had the opportunity to look, for instance, at big infrastructure projects being funded in countries like various countries in Africa. What investors are also asking now is the impact, you see, of those investments, especially when you are in the energy sector. Is the extent to which, for instance, you are engaging with the local community, especially in instances where the communities may need to be displaced, and relocated elsewhere. So they're becoming pressing issue that we cannot completely disregard. So for me, I can only see the interest heightening, not just from the government, because quite often the government is like the executing, or maybe one of the department, the Minister of Finance could be the executing agency or partner in a project, but investors are demanding that more and more. But on the other hand, you will realize that They may not have had all the processes in place and so forth, like the environmental, social, some analysis, for instance, need to be even done before the project moves to the next stage. So the need is certainly there. It has heightened, and I don't see it like going backwards.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I mean, we've seen in South Africa, there was a, I saw our partner from Turkey is here, met up. So there was the car power, you know, the ships that will bring power to South Africa, because we've been having these rolling outages to assist our national power regulator to sort of get back on board. And there were these huge contracts, lots of money involved with these ships coming from Turkey to supply the power. And in fact, that has been stopped because of environmental impact studies that were not done apparently properly. And the Minister of Environmental Affairs, Barbara Greasy, has said, sorry, guys, you haven't done your homework. We cannot go ahead. And this is, you know, billions of dollars that we're talking about. And that's just one example. I mean, we know that there are some countries, Nathalie, you would know, I think it's Kenya is a zero one-use plastic country. You're not allowed to take any one-use plastic in there. I think Uganda is another one. So they certainly are even governmental, you know, pressures, being put on these things.
And even beyond that, countries or project sponsors are mandated to report on ESG. They've got to report on that, and which I find quite important. Because in the past, you know, you could go anywhere and just set up a waste management business. The way you run it doesn't really matter as long as you're making money to the detriment of your direct community. Nowadays, you know, a corporation will have to think twice before doing that. And not just corporation, I mean, even public SOE, state-owned enterprises. So I'm actually very happy with the increased importance of including all those ESG criteria into projects.
Yeah, absolutely. And these reports need to go to shareholders these days. So, you know, companies are just not investing if unless they see that you've got some plans in place. And that would possibly be part of our next discussion, which would be a little bit around, you know, what is important, what sort of drives investment from an ESG perspective going forward. And also how that relates to Africa. Khalid, are you still with us? Yes, you are. Do you have a question that you want to throw in? A very last one that came through from the attendants.
Yes, there is one from Pauline. She was asking which countries or areas other than China, of course, have been investing recently in the African continent, and which industries.
Okay, great. What we've seen, obviously, you will know that China has been one of the biggest investors on the continent, but the focus has been more into infrastructure projects. I don't know if you've heard about this Belt Road Initiative driven by the Chinese government and so forth. And interestingly, many countries have signed up to that. But recently, there's increased interest from the Japanese. And the Japanese, through JICA, are obviously investing in energy projects and in railways, energy specifically in Kenya. Like there's a power plant there working with CHINJE-N. And what I like about the Japanese is this focus on quality infrastructure. So let's not just have infrastructure for the sake of having infrastructure. Let's make sure that we build long-lasting infrastructure for the continent. And they also tend to place a strong emphasis on technical skills transfer, which is very important. So instead of bringing the labor force into the market to do the work and to leave without leaving something behind, they will bring them, but they have the responsibility to train the local. So we've seen the Japanese investing. We've seen interest from Russia, I think not just from, as we may think, from the security side and so forth. We've seen interest from Russia and other countries like Australia, specifically in the mining industry, Australia and Canada. Canada has actually been a player on the continent, but not an active one, but more investment also from our Canadian and Brazilian counterpart. Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you.
excellent. Yeah, and I know you were involved with some Japanese projects before, Nathalie. I saw that somewhere along the line. I must say, in South Africa, it's been very interesting how active the Japanese embassy has been in the last number of years, actually in transferring cultural, sort of creating cultural conversations and bringing their culture in wonderful, especially with regard to the film industry, etc., to South Africa, which was really super interesting. So yeah, I think they certainly probably need a partner with some young people, and Africa can certainly offer a lot of young people, so maybe that's a good partner for them in that sense as well.
Yeah.
So that, I think, brings us to the end, unless from our other partners, if there's anything else that you want to add. Khalid, that's the last one?
We had
Yes.
a question from Maria, but she had to leave. Khalid, do you have it?
Yes, Maria was asking, she was actually wondering what are the restrictions, obstacles, or concerns that prevent private sector from investing, especially those large European conglomerates?
Okay. So, so we're talking about the key inhibitors from, first of all, in a country where you do not have a proper legal framework, it makes it quite difficult for you to invest. Things like an investment code, for instance, if you were to invest X billion, are you able to repatriate that money within the same year, or do you have to wait for 5 years? Quite often, investors are eager, they see the opportunity, they want to jump in, but it's also very important to always ask about the investment code of this country so that you can familiarize yourself and understand in the upstream stages what you're getting yourself into. That's very important. In some markets, we still have strong governance issues also. By that, I mean lack of transparency and so forth, which in a way inhibit credible investors to pursue their Pan-African strategy. Some organizations used to say in South Africa, okay, well, I'm MTN or Vodacom. What I do here in South Africa doesn't affect me outside of South African border. That's not true. I mean, with the King 4 corporate governance, you are in a way also impacted. Whatever you do as an agent of that corporation in any of its operation in the world, you will be obviously taken to task. So you need to bear that in mind. In some markets, we still have issues around literacy rate, skills. I mean, that's not the same for markets like Zimbabwe or Ghana and so forth. But in some market in Africa, you still have that. So you need to be able to invest quite a lot into your workforce and capacitate them. And more importantly, be very, very patient. One of the barriers that has been given to me mainly by, I would say, English-speaking African countries for not expanding into other parts of the continent is a language barrier, which doesn't make sense. I mean, when you have an organization from Russia or South Korea or even India or China that sees an opportunity in Africa, they will find a way of doing business. But that sometimes has been obviously identified as one of the barriers for those corporations to do business in a country. In some countries like South Africa, for instance, and because of the imbalances of the past and the country trying to redress the society, companies have to, in a way, invest a portion of their income into enterprise development initiative. So it is something that you also need to budget well in advance and make it sustainable, not just for the next first 3 or 5 years, but you need to make sure that it's part, it's embedded in your whole strategy. Enterprise development, actually, for it to work properly, you've got to make sure that the people that you are upskilling, equipping, or capacitating are thereafter included into your own supplier chain. That's, for me, is success. If you are able to take an organization from nowhere, you've capacitated the business and you've given them the tool to do business with you, that's amazing. So it's not just a question of regrouping small businesses, having a workshop. No, it doesn't end there. Most of the SMEs will tell you, we just need an opportunity to do business with you. We need one contract and we'll do the rest. And quite often, multinationals tend to be quite reluctant because they will say they are too small and there may be a reputational risk if we deal with that organization because they don't understand our processes and our system. But it also creates an opportunity for you as a multinational to invest, not just as part of the enterprise development program as enacted by the law in South Africa, but make it part of your own strategy. So I'm just going to leave it at that, but these are kind of some of the challenges that others have encountered.
Yeah, and that's also part of sustainable business, isn't it? Because
yes, exactly.
It's part of building your employer brand. You know, people know stuff. They find out what you're doing in all the countries these days, as you were saying earlier. So you can't say, okay, I'm going to be a great citizen when I do business in the US, but you know, I'm going to, when I employ some people in a factory in Thailand or in Kenya, I'm just, you know, not going to pay them livable wages. It doesn't fly anymore. So I think that enterprise development is also part of long-term sustainable business, of doing good and doing well by doing good, which is you know, what we like to see in sustainable business. And our young people are following those brands, you know, and they can see which companies are really investing and really doing that sustainable business, not just from an environmental perspective, but certainly also from a people development perspective, which means that we can build the sustainability of our workforce. So thank you for that. Very, very, very good. I think very good last words. Thank you, Dr. Nath. You have been absolutely amazing. You've got such a vast insight and knowledge about these topics, and I'm sure we can probably have spoken for another couple of hours, but we'll have to leave it here. We're already over time, and I'm very sure that we will see you again at eyeAfrica. We would love to cooperate with you again.
Thank you. I would like to thank you, Leonie, for really spearheading this initiative in South Africa, for your thought, for your support, and really bringing a community of people who share the same passion on this platform. I can only wish you well, and I remain available, even not as a speaker, but as a supporter of eyeAfrica and AIMS International. Thank you so much.